In the winter of 1888, on a wagon road called Greer's Pass in the Bitterroot country of Montana Territory, a young woman handed over $11 for a cabin no one else would touch, and the men gathered at the land agent's stove laughed at her before she had even cleared the door. The cabin sat near the top of the pass at better than 6,000 feet, and it had been frozen shut for 3 winters running. Snow had drifted to the eaves and packed against the north wall until the logs themselves were sheathed in a foot of blue ice that never fully gave way, even in August. The last man to live there had walked down to the valley in the spring of 1885 and never gone back up. And the story that came down with him was that the place was bad luck, that the cold inside it was a different cold than the cold outside, and that whatever a person stored in it would be kept exactly as it was left, untouched and unspoiled, as though the cabin had stopped being part of the moving world. People said it the way they said many things on the pass, half in jest and half not, and the land office sold the parcel for back taxes because no buyer of sound mind would climb that road to claim it. Her name was Tess Hollow, and she was 26 years old. She had come into the valley 2 weeks before with a mule, a canvas-wrapped roll of tools, and almost nothing else. The men at the stove took her measure in a glance and decided she was a fool, and they were not quiet about it. One of them said she had bought herself a block of ice with a roof on it. Another said she could chip her supper out of the walls. She folded the bill of sale into her coat and thanked the agent and went out into the street. And she did not answer them because the things she knew she had no intention of explaining to men who had already made up their minds. What none of them knew was what she had come for. What none of them knew was that the cold they laughed at was the very thing she had climbed the pass to find. You may already be wondering what a person would want with a cabin that would not thaw. Hold that question. It is the same question Tess held, and the answer was waiting at the top of the road under 3 winters of snow. Tess Hollow had been raised by her uncle, a man named Amos Vane, who had kept an ice house and a meat locker on the edge of a railroad town 200 miles to the east. He had no children of his own, and when Tess came to him, orphaned at 9, he had set her to work beside him rather than send her away, and that work had become the whole shape of her growing up. Amos understood cold the way some men understand horses or weather or the turning of a profit. He knew how to cut blocks from a frozen river so they would not split, how to pack them in sawdust so a single harvest would last from one winter clear through to the next, how to read the breath of a sealed room and tell from the feel of the air against the back of his hand whether it was holding or failing. He taught her all of it without ceremony, the way he taught her everything, by handing her the work and standing close enough to correct it. He used to tell her that cold was not nothing. Most men treated it as the absence of warmth, as an emptiness, as a thing that happened when heat went away. Amos said that was backward. Cold was a keeper. Cold held what warmth let go. A thing kept cold enough, sealed right and left alone, did not rot and did not change and did not forget what it had been. He said it standing in the blue dark of his locker with his hand flat against a wall of ice. And she had been perhaps 14, and she had not understood then that he was telling her something she would need. Amos died in the autumn of 1887, a year before the pass. He died without much to leave, because the railroad had built its own ice plant the year before, and his trade had thinned to nothing, and the bank had taken the locker and the house, and most of what was in them. There was one thing the bank did not take, however, because it did not know to look for it, and it was a thing Amos had spoken of only once, near the end, when the fever had loosened his guard. He told her about a man named Elias Crane. Crane had been a partner of his long ago in the years before Tess was born. The two of them had run ice and stored goods together up and down the valley line. and Crane had been the one with the head for money while Amos was the one with the hands. Then, Crane had gone into land and freight and lending, and he had risen, and Amos had stayed where he was, and the partnership had ended in a way Amos would not fully describe, except to say that Crane had taken something that was not his and had papered it so well that no court would ever pull it back. There had been a strong box, Amos said. There had been an accounting that would have shown the theft plain. And the box had gone up to a cold place on a high road to be kept, because Crane trusted cold the way Amos had taught him to, and because no one would ever think to climb after it. Amos had not told her where, not exactly. Before the fever took him under for the last time, he had said the name of the pass, though, and he had said the thing that Tess carried down the eastern slope and across 200 miles of country and into the land agent's office where the men laughed at her. He had said, "A cold place keeps an honest account when every warm office burns one." So she bought the cabin, $11 for a thing that would not thaw, on a road that climbed into the sky. The climb took her the better part of 2 days. The road above the valley narrowed to a track, and the track narrowed to a memory of a track, switching back across slopes of dark pine where the snow lay deep and untracked, and the only sound was the mule's breath and her own. She had wrapped her boots in burlap over the leather, and she led the animal rather than ride it, testing each turn of the road for the soft. Give that meant a drift had buried a drop. Twice she had to dig. Once she had to unpack the mule entirely and carry the load across a stretch where the snow had bridged a gap she did not trust, ferrying the canvas roll and the sacks of meal one at a time on her shoulder, while the mule stood trembling on the firm ground behind her. The cold up there was not the cold of the valley. In the valley, the cold sat on a person like a wet coat. On the pass, it was a living thing that searched for the gaps in her wrapping, the place where her glove parted from her sleeve, the seam at her collar, and it pressed in wherever it found a way. She knew this cold. She had been raised inside a smaller and tamer version of it, and she did not fear it the way the men below would have feared it, but she respected it, because Amos had taught her that the cold did not hate a person and did not love a person, and would kill a careless one without ever once meaning harm. She rested when her mind began to wander, because a wandering mind on a frozen slope was the first sign of the cold getting in past the body to the will. She ate before she was hungry, and stopped before she was spent. By the time the cabin came into view in the last gray light of the second day, she had been cold to the bone for so long that the cold had stopped feeling like a thing apart from her and had become simply the condition of being alive. The cabin was exactly as they had said. It stood in a small flat shoulder of the pass, with pines crowding close on the uphill side, and the land falling away below into blue distance. The north wall was a slope of ice. The door was sealed in it. Snow had drifted across the whole lower half of the structure, and frozen and thawed and frozen again into a glaze that caught the failing light. It didn't look like a place where anyone had ever lived. It looked like a thing the mountain had swallowed and not finished. She made no attempt on it that night. She built a fire in the lee of a great fallen pine, fed the mule and ate, and slept under canvas with the animal's warmth at her back. And in the morning, in the clean, hard light off the snow, she began. This is the part the men at the stove could not have pictured, because they did not know what her hands had been taught to do. They thought the cold was her enemy. She knew the cold was the lock, and she knew locks. She did not attack the ice. That was the first thing Amos had drilled into her, that ice is brittle and stubborn both at once, and will shatter where you want it whole and hold where you want it broken if you fight it. You did not fight ice. You read its grain the way a cooper reads a stave or a mason reads a seam, and you worked with the lines already in it. She spent the whole of that first morning simply looking. She walked the cabin 3 times around. She laid her bare hand against the glaze in a dozen places and felt for where it was bonded to the log and where it had pulled away in a hidden gap. She found the door by the faint vertical seam where the ice had cracked along the jamb and refrozen, a line no wider than a thread, and she marked it with a smear of soot from the fire. Then she got her tools out of the canvas roll, a short-handled ice axe with a head Amos had forged himself, a wooden mallet, a row of iron wedges, the largest no longer than her hand, a small spirit lamp and a tin of lamp oil, and the thing she trusted most, which was patience, which was not a tool a man could see in a roll of canvas, and which was why the men had thought the roll held nothing of use. She worked the seam for 3 days. She did not try to break the door free in a single afternoon, which is what a strong and foolish man would have done, and which would have cracked the ice across the grain and brought a slab of it down, and very likely broken her arm in the bargain. She drove the small wedges into the thread of the seam, a finger's width at a time, tapping, never striking, letting the iron do the splitting that her arm could not. When the seam widened, she warmed the spirit lamp and held its small flame to the iron of the wedge, not to the ice. So the warmth crept into the metal and from the metal into the bond and loosened it from within without sending a shock through the brittle face. She melted hollows for her fingers. She chipped with the grain and never against it. The first day she gained perhaps a hand's breadth along the top of the door, and no more, and a lesser worker would have despaired of it. She did not. She had watched Amos take a full week once to free a single great block from a river that had frozen wrong, and she had learned from him that the measure of a day's work in cold was not how much ice you moved, but whether you had moved it without breaking what you needed whole. The second day, the seam ran clear down the left jamb, and she could see, when she put her lamp close, the faint dark line of the gap behind it, the place where the door had pulled away from the frame in some long-ago thaw and refrozen with the air of the room sealed inside. That gap was the thing she worked toward. That gap was the proof that the room had kept. The third day the cold turned bitter even by the measure of the pass, and a wind came down off the high snow and drove her back to the fire twice before noon. She did not fight the wind any more than she fought the ice. She waited it out in the lee of the fallen pine, with her hands inside her coat against her own ribs, and when it dropped, she went back to the seam. At the end of each short day, when the light failed and the cold deepened past the point where her hands could be trusted to hold the tools, she stopped, whether she had made progress or not, because Amos had taught her that the work you do with a numb hand is the work you undo with a rested one. On the morning of the 4th day, the door came free. It did not burst or fall. It swung inward perhaps a hand's width with a long groan of ice, releasing its grip along the top edge, and a breath of air came out of the dark gap and across her face, and she went very still. The air was old. That was the only word she had for it. It was colder than the morning around her, and it was dry, and it carried no smell of rot or mildew or animal, none of the sourness a closed cabin should have held after 3 years. It smelled of nothing at all, the way the inside of Amos's locker had smelled of nothing, and she understood standing there with her hand on the frozen door that the stories were true in the only way that mattered. The cabin had kept. Whatever was inside it was inside it still, exactly as it had been left, held in a cold that did not let go. She lit her lamp and went in. I will tell you what she found in a moment. First, though, understand what it meant to her to find a room that time had not touched, because that is the thing this whole story turns on, and it is worth the patience it asks of you. The single room of the cabin was small and low, and the lamp showed it to her in pieces as she turned. A table, a chair, fallen on its side, a bunk against the far wall with a folded blanket on it, stiff as a board, a cold stove with a kettle still on its top, and everything, every surface was furred with a fine white frost that had grown in the still air like a kind of slow pale moss, so that the room looked less like a place abandoned than a place enchanted, a room asleep under a glass no one had broken in 3 years. Her breath hung in the lamplight. Nothing moved but the small flame and her own shadow. The man who had walked down in 1885 had left in a hurry, but not in panic. The signs of it were all there for a person who knew how to read a room, and Tess had been taught to read rooms the way she'd been taught to read ice. The blanket was folded. The kettle was set square on the stove. The boots were gone from under the bunk, but the spare were lying neat against the wall. He had meant to come back. He had closed the place up the way a careful man closes up for a season, and then the season had become 3 years, and the cold had done to the room what the cold does, which is to keep it waiting. She did not find the strong box that first day. She found it on the second day inside, and she found it because she stopped looking for a box and started looking for a place a box would be hidden by a man who trusted cold. The floor was the answer. Amos had taught her that the coldest, stillest, most reliable place in any sealed structure is low and against the earth, where the chill pools and holds, and that any man who knew cold and wanted a thing kept would put it there. She cleared the frost from the floorboards with the side of her hand and went over them on her knees, pressing, listening to the change in the sound under her knuckles, and near the cold stove she found 3 boards that gave back a hollow note where the others rang solid. The nails in those 3 boards were not rusted to the same degree as their neighbors. They had been pulled and reset. She had seen the same tell 100 times in her uncle's locker, where a board lifted and replaced never quite matched its fellows again, and she knew it for what it was before she ever pried the first plank up. She lifted them. Beneath was a shallow pit lined with sawdust gone hard as packed sand, and set down into the sawdust, frosted white but whole, was an iron strongbox the size of a small trunk. It took her the rest of that day to bring it up, and it was not the weight that slowed her but the cold. The box was bonded to the sawdust and the sawdust to the earth, all of it locked in a single frozen mass, and she warmed it free the way she had warmed the door, with patience, and the spirit lamp, and an understanding of how cold lets go, which is slowly, and only when it is ready, and never when it is forced. She worked the warmth in at the corners first, where the bond was thinnest, and she rocked the box no more than a hair's width at a time, feeling through her palms for the small surrenders as the ice released its hold. A man in a hurry would have set a bar under it and heaved and split the frozen sawdust and very likely the lock with it. She did not hurry. When at last it stood free on the floorboards, she did not open it. She had no key, and the lock was a good one. But a lock was a thing she had been taught about too, and she knew that a frozen lock is a fragile lock, and that she would have to bring it down to the valley and let it thaw slow and whole before she dared work it, or risk shattering the very mechanism she needed to turn. What she did instead that evening was sit beside it in the cold room with her lamp and rest her hand on its frosted lid and think of Amos, who had stood with his hand on a wall of ice and told a girl of 14 that cold was a keeper. She had not understood him then. She understood him now. Somewhere under her hand, sealed in iron and held in a cold that had not relented in 3 winters, was the honest account that every warm office had burned. Bringing the box down the pass was harder than bringing herself up it had been. She built a low sledge from the cabin's own loose boards and a length of rope, and she eased it down the switchbacks a few feet at a time, with the rope snubbed around trees. And twice the whole load nearly went over the edge, and twice she held it. And by the time she reached the valley, her hands were so torn through the gloves that she could not close them, and she had to wrap them and wait 2 days before she could work at all. She took a room above the livery. She set the box in the corner where it was coldest and let it come up to the room's temperature over 4 slow days, turning it, watching the frost retreat from the iron, because a thing brought up from deep cold too fast will sweat and swell and seize, and she had not carried it 200 miles and down a mountain to ruin it in a warm room through haste. Word went around the valley that the woman who had bought the ice cabin had come back down with something. The men who had laughed were not laughing now, but they were not kind either, and a few of them found reasons to be near the livery, watching. She did not hide the box, and she did not show it. She let them watch. Amos had taught her that too without ever saying it. A person sure of her work does not need to perform it. On the 5th day she worked the lock. It was a good lock and an old one, and the cold had not broken it because she had not let it. She had no key, but she had her uncle's fine picks and the patience he had ground into her. And she sat at the small table by the window with the light coming in across her hands and felt her way through the mechanism the way she had felt her way through the ice, reading rather than forcing until the last pin gave and the bolt drew back with a sound like a held breath let go. She opened the lid. Inside, dry and whole and exactly as a careful man had left them, were papers. Ledgers, bound in board, loose deeds folded in quarters, a bundle of letters tied with string, and on top, where a man would put the thing he most wanted found, a single sheet in a hand she did not know, dated in the spring of 1885. That began with the words, "To whoever has the wit and the will to climb after the truth." The man who had lived in the cabin had a name, and his name was Josiah Reed, and he had not been a hermit or a fool. He had been Elias Crane's bookkeeper for 11 years, and he had been an honest man in a dishonest house for far too long. And when he understood at last what Crane had done, and what his own hand had helped to write, he had done the only thing left to a man in his position. He had copied it all. The true ledgers against the false. The original deeds that Crane had replaced with forgeries in the county record. The wage books showing the men Crane had cheated of 3 years' pay when he closed the upper mine and swore there had been no money, while the real accounting showed the money plain. Reed had gathered the proof of all of it, and he had carried it up to a cabin on a pass that would not thaw, and he had sealed it in cold because cold was a keeper, and a warm office could be burned, and he had written a letter to a stranger he would never meet, and then he had walked down the mountain meaning to find a lawyer brave enough to use it. He had died that same spring in the valley of a lung fever before he found his lawyer, and the proof had stayed on the pass, kept, waiting, for 3 winters until a woman who understood cold climbed after it. Tess read the letter twice. Then she read the ledgers slowly over 3 days in the room above the livery, checking each false entry against its true twin until she understood the whole shape of what Crane had done and the whole shape of what would undo him. The work of it was the same work her hands knew, the patient matching of a thing against its grain. Crane had not been a crude thief. He had been a careful one, and the false ledgers were nearly perfect, the figures adjusted by small amounts spread across many pages so that no single entry shouted, and a man reading the false book alone would never have caught it. Set beside the true book, though, every small lie stood out plain, a column that should have summed to one figure and summed instead to another, a payment recorded as made that the true book showed was never made at all. Reed had known his trade. He had left her not just the proof, but the key to reading the proof, a folded sheet that named which page of the false book answered to which page of the true, so that even a stranger could follow the theft from end to end. And the thing she felt, sitting there with the two books open under the lamp, was not triumph. It was something quieter and harder to carry. It was the weight of being the one who held it now. Have you ever known a true thing that no one would believe until you could put it in their hands? That was where she stood, with the proof on the table, and the man who had hidden it 3 years dead, and the man who had stolen it living fat in a fine house at the bottom of the valley. The rest of this is how she said it right. It did not happen the way the men at the stove would have wanted, with a confrontation and a shout. It happened the way Amos would have done it, which is to say it happened with patience, and with documents, and with the truth simply made impossible to look away from. She did not go to Crane. She never once, in the whole of what followed, stood in a room with him, and that was deliberate. A man like Crane was practiced at rooms. He could talk his way out of any room. What he could not talk his way out of was the county record, and that was where she took what she had. The recorder of deeds in the valley was an old man named Pell, careful and slow and honest in the small, dogged way of men who have spent 40 years making sure the columns add. Tess brought him first not the ledgers, which he had no standing to judge, but the deeds, the original deeds in Reed's careful hand, with the proper seals and the proper dates, and she laid them beside the deeds in Pell's own books, the forged ones, and she said only, "Look at the dates, and look at the hand, and tell me which is older." Pell looked for a long time. He bent over the 2 sets of papers with a glass he kept on a black ribbon, and he turned them to the window light and he traced the seals with one yellowed finger, and he said nothing at all for the better part of an hour, while Tess stood and waited and did not hurry him, because she had learned from Amos that a careful man rushed is a careful man made careless, and she needed Pell careful. When he looked up, his face had changed, because an honest record-keeper who discovers that his record has been salted with lies feels it as a wound, and Pell had kept those books for 20 years believing them. He said, in a voice gone thin, that the forged deeds had been entered the year Crane closed the upper mine, and that he had entered some of them himself, with his own hand, trusting the papers a clerk of Crane's had brought him. Then he was quiet again, and Tess understood that he was counting backward through 20 years of his own work, and wondering what else had been false. She did not comfort him. She let him arrive at it. A man who has built his life on the truth of his records does not need comfort when he finds a lie in them. He needs to set them right, and she had brought him the means to do it. From there it moved the way such things move when the paper is real and the keeper is honest, which is slowly and then all at once. Pell brought in the territorial assessor, a brisk man named Doyle who came expecting to dismiss a woman's grievance and stayed past dark with the ledgers open under a lamp. Doyle brought in a lawyer named Hartley, a careful young man with no love for Crane and no fear of him either, who had been waiting most of his short career for exactly the kind of proof that could not be argued away. And the proof did its work without Tess ever raising her voice, because that is what real proof does. The false deeds were withdrawn. The true deeds were entered. The wage books were opened, and the names of the cheated miners were read out one by one in the dry air of the recorder's office, and they were men with descendants still in the valley. And one of those descendants was a woman near Tess's own age named Cora Boone, whose father had gone to his grave believing himself a failure, because Crane had told the whole valley that the mine had simply run dry, and there had been no wages to pay. Tess sought Cora out herself. She did not send word through a lawyer. She walked to the Boone place, a pour holding on the valley's stony north end, where the wind came off the rim and the fences leaned, and she put into Cora's hands the page of the wage book, with her father's name on it, and the sum beside it that he had earned and never been paid. And she said, "Your father was owed this, and he was right to feel cheated, and the record says so now." Cora read it. She was a spare woman with work-hardened hands and a guarded face, and she read the page twice, and then a third time, the way a person reads a thing they have waited so long for that they cannot at first believe it has come. She did not weep, not at first. She stood in the doorway holding the page and reading her father's name as though the name itself were the thing she had been waiting years to have returned to her. The name of a man the valley had called a failure, and who had believed them. Then she said the only thing either of them said in that doorway. She said, "He thought it was his own fault. He went to his grave thinking it was his own fault." And Tess said, "It was never his fault, and the paper proves it." And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Cora folded the page once, carefully, and held it against her like something living, and the two women stood a moment in the cold doorway with the wind off the rim, and neither needed to say more. Elias Crane was not arrested in a dramatic scene, and there was no reckoning in a courtroom with a crowd. That is not how men like Crane fall, and this story will not pretend otherwise. What happened was that the foundation of falsified paper that he had stood on for 15 years was pulled out from under him a sheet at a time, in the slow, dry procedures of a recorder's office and a territorial court. And as it went, the men who had lent him money grew nervous, and the men who had stood with him grew scarce, and the deeds reverted, and the back wages were ordered paid from what could be seized, and within a year, Elias Crane was a man whom the valley no longer trusted with anything, which for a man like Crane was a kind of death. He sold what he could and left the valley before the second winter. Tess never saw him go. She did not need to. The truth had done to him what no gun could have done, and it had done it without her ever lifting her hand against him, and that was exactly as it should have been. She did not grow rich. The proof she had carried down was not treasure, and she had never treated it as treasure. The back wages went to the families they were owed to. The reverted land went to the heirs of the men it had been stolen from. What came to Tess, by the order of the court, and the quiet insistence of Cora Boone and the others, was the cabin on the pass, deeded to her clear and free. The thing she had bought for $11, now hers in the county, record beyond any question, and a small sum for her labor that she did not refuse, because Amos had taught her there was no shame in being paid for honest work. She went back up the pass the next summer when the road was clear and the high meadows were green, and she did to the cabin what Josiah Reed had never had the chance to do. She did not let it freeze shut again. She cleared the ice from the north wall and let the logs dry in the sun for the first time in years. She rehung the door so it swung true. She put a new kettle on the old stove and lit a fire in it, and the smoke rose straight up into the blue, and the cabin that had been a tomb on a cold road became a place where a person could live. She kept the strongbox. She emptied it of its papers, which went into the safekeeping of the court and the families, and she brought it back up the pass empty and set it in the corner of the room, and she used it for what such a box is for, to keep things. She did not bury it in the floor, however, and she did not seal it in cold. She had learned what her uncle meant, all the way down to the bottom of it, and she had learned the part he had not lived to say, which was that cold keeps a thing safe, but it also keeps it hidden, and that a truth kept too long in the cold does no good to anyone, until a warm hand brings it up into the light. The men who had laughed at the land agent's stove came around in the way such men do, which is not all at once and not with any grand apology. One of them, the one who had said she had bought a block of ice with a roof on it, brought a wagon of milled lumber up the pass that summer and left it at her door and said only that the road was hard on a sledge and a person fixing a place might have use for it. She thanked him and did not mention what he had said in the winter. There was no need. The work had said it for her. Cora Boone came up too, more than once, and the two of them became something the valley did not quite have a word for. Two solitary women who had each been handed a hard thing and had not broken under it. Cora brought seeds the first time, and they put in a small garden in the cleared ground on the south side, where the snow went first, and over the years that garden came back each summer, green against the gray logs, a small living thing in a place that had been about nothing but keeping and waiting. Tess Hollow lived on the pass for many years. She took in ice work and tool work and lock work from the valley below, and people learned to climb the road to her rather than laugh at it, and the cabin that no one would touch for $11 became known as a place where a thing that was broken could be brought to be made right, whether it was a frozen pump or a stuck lock or a question of who a piece of land truly belonged to. She grew old there. The auburn went gray in the loose braid at the nape of her neck. The red shawl she had climbed the pass in, the one bright, warm thing she had carried up into all that cold, hung on a peg by the door and was the first thing a visitor saw coming in out of the weather. And the strongbox stayed in the corner, empty and open, never locked again. A plain iron box that had once held the truth and now held nothing but a few small tools and a folded blanket, kept not because it was cold, but because a person had finally come, who knew the difference between keeping a thing and burying it. She used to say to the few who climbed up and asked that the cold had not been bad luck at all. The cold had been doing its work the whole time. It had kept an honest account through 3 winters when every warm office in the valley would have burned it, and it had asked only for someone with the wit and the will and the taut hands to climb after the truth and bring it down into the light. What she did not say, because she did not need to, was that her uncle had told her how. He had stood with his hand on a wall of ice when she was 14 and told her that cold was a keeper, and she had not understood. And then, one winter, she had climbed a frozen pass and understood everything. The kettle stayed on the stove, the shawl stayed on its peg, and the box stayed open in the corner, holding nothing, hiding nothing, in a cabin where the door swung true and the fire was lit.